Okay.
And I do 2 miles sort of religiously because my grandmother always walked 2 miles a day. So it's sort of in honor of her.
Oh, beautiful. Okay.
Yeah. So
Cool.
anyway,
Now the image behind you, your wonderful, it almost looks like a map with the
you
squares
know what
and
it is? It's the periodic table of elements.
turns into art. Oh my God, I love that. That is
Yes.
so awesome.
There's a wonderful artist named Degard who I encountered in a consciousness discussion group, and
Oh.
she was making art out of each of the elements, oxygen, nitrogen, etc. And I said, what if you did a periodic table? She said, what's a periodic table? And I was like, ah!
It must have blown her mind when she
did.
realized that it all fit together like a jigsaw puzzle.
Yeah, so then she said this to me and I was so honored.
That has to have been one of the most exciting 60 seconds in the entire history of the planet.
Yeah.
Don't you? When
Yes,
he
just
suddenly
recognizing
realized that there was a principle behind this, and that he could predict which new atoms were going to be discovered. I just think that it must have been so mind-blowing. It's like, oh my,
Mendeleev.
there is a mind of God after
Yes,
all.
well, and he saw it in a dream, of course. So
Yes. I
yes,
love that. I love that. That is gorgeous. So that's an original piece of art.
yeah, isn't that
Wow.
cool? Yeah, I love it.
So
So
here's my piece of art.
ooh.
This is artificial intelligence taken into Adobe Photoshop and tweaked around the mouth and eyes until I could get an image that I felt was Galileo in the afterlife.
Wow.
Galileo, as he realizes what his contribution is actually going to mean,
Wow.
after all of the humiliation and going blind and being slapped down by the bishops, suddenly he sees. I was like, I need that. That's my image. He is my hero.
Okay, can we talk about, okay, here's my question for you. Rebecca, what is your passion?
Well, Galileo is a clue. Galileo is a clue because I realized, and I just had this confirmed this past week when I started rereading Pierre Teilhard de Chardin's book, The Phenomenon of Man. And he has this amazing quote. And again, another scientist thrown out by the church and left to rot in some little backwater of China because they didn't like his science. He says, scientific research is the purest form of worship.
Yes.
Isn't that gorgeous?
And true.
It's like, okay, that's kind of it. Because
Yeah.
my passion is research.
Yeah.
I mean, anything that comes up, it's like, I want to know, I want to understand, and I will go to whatever lengths.
Can we go down that rabbit hole? Like exactly how, so I intuitively, I go, yes, right? But can we go down the rabbit hole of why that would even have anything to do with worship and what that means?
Well, I think, well, of course, you look back at your childhood, and since I was raised Irish Roman Catholic, being obedient was the chief virtue. So you did not ask questions. That was not part of your responsibility. And I had a signature event when I was 7 years old. I was a very precocious reader. I loved library books. And I would always look enviously at my mother's stack of library books because hers were much fatter than mine. And even at 7, I recognized there was something different about my books. So I remember this one day, my mother and grandmother were sitting at the dining room table, and I was reading the titles of my mother's stack of books. And one of the books had this really, really long word. And I could sound it out, but I had no idea what it meant. So I took the book over to my mother and grandmother and I said, what does this word mean? I think it's reincarnation. My mother was like, yes, that is. It's reincarnation. And my grandmother began to get this long, sour face. My mother was explaining reincarnation is the idea that you don't just live once, that you have multiple lives, that you come back and you die and then you come back as something else. And my immediate response was, I didn't know there was a word for that. It was like, of course, we know that that's what happens. I didn't know they had this fancy word for it. And my grandmother looked absolutely shocked. And she said, we Catholics don't believe in that. And something in me, I still remember this feeling of something flipping over, like, whoomp, almost like that. What do you mean we don't believe in it? Who's we? What is this belief thing? It was like it was the challenge that sparked and broke something open. In my mind, I have to think that it stems all the way back from that. There was this rebelliousness that, no, I'm not taking that for an answer. And I felt a little indignant that I had been deprived of this knowledge for 7 years.
So it was the flipping. Yeah. So what happened there?
Well, I think after that point, I became a questioner, because now I understood that certain types of information had been kept from me and were likely to be kept from me. That there was another force that worked against the force of knowledge, and that I had to be on the lookout for it. I mean, my father was always questioning. So he was this ally in the quest to overturn the silencing of the curiosity of the human spirit. So he was always poking and prodding and trying to open things up. And that spirit was just pervasive. I mean, even my mother eventually decided to go with the program of more questions, less answers, as being an okay place to live.
It sounds to me like more questions, less answers, but also from an internal point of view, more awareness that the inner space has some authority.
Well, I mean, that just the term inner space is really critical, because one of the things I realized is that a lot of American culture wants to deny the inner space any reality or agency at all. And so keeping a very strong inner space is one of the courageous acts. It's an act of eternal vigilance. In other words, everything in our culture wants you to pay attention only to the surface of things, or what you might call the food sheath of the body, right? In Buddhism, the food sheath is like the lowest one, the eating and the defecating.
It's like the meat puppet.
The meat puppet, right.
Yeah.
And that you can get completely lost in the needs and wants and whininess of the food sheath, and that you have to make some effort to move into the deeper or higher levels of the human physiology, as it were. So yeah, the inner life was really important, and that it had a critical role to play in how the food sheath part of the body experiences life. Yeah, so
what is that role like? Just can you say a little more about that?
Well, I like to think of it as aerating, right? Because if you're only at the surface level of life, you don't recognize the entire root system, so the interconnected web of being. You think that you're just a little tiny plant all by yourself, and that your one little blossom is all that there is. And you can get very anxious and stressed, and just like the navel gazing of self-interest. And then you miss the enormity of the interconnectedness of things. So part of the inner space is also the connected space, where you go out through the root system, literally, but also the biosphere, the mythosphere, the noosphere, going back to Jardin. There's a lot more to us, and being able to recognize how much more there is allows things to have their proper balance.
Well, this sounds almost exactly like you're describing what the work of research is.
Well, I suppose it really depends on who you are as a researcher and what it is that you're looking for. And I always try to gravitate to the very top of the research, question, and not just ask the who, what, where, when, but why. What is the ultimate goal of what it is I'm researching? So to take Teilhard de Chardin as a beautiful example. Here's someone who's a paleontologist. He's looking at little rocks and stones and bone shards. And you could surely get totally lost and blissed out about these little episodes of finding this. And, oh, these two shards go together. Oh, and this skull looks a little bit. But his mind is always working on this much higher level, which is how do I reconcile Darwin's theory of evolution with the Christology that I love and intuitively feel is correct, which is that all humanity is part of a sacred being trying to grow itself into awareness. How do I reconcile these two apparently, as according to the church, divergent streams of thought? My intuition is no, they are absolutely the same story. How do I show that? So everything that he's researching has this incredible vertical dimension, so that he has no problem going back to the Big Bang and showing how it's related to a realized eschatology of the Christian faith. I mean, you've got to admire someone who has that much audacity. It's like, okay, everybody tells me this is totally different. I have no business as a scientist going into theology, no business as a theologian going into science, and I say bunk. This is exactly where I belong. I am the one who has incarnated to weave these two threads together in such a way that someday you are going to come up with the Gaia hypotheses and prove that the planet itself is a self-regulating organism with a consciousness. So take that, right?
Yes. So
yeah.
Let me ask you. So Galileo, this guy, is sort of showing the history of this passion of yours. Where do you take it?
So a lot of my passion has to do right now, and certainly there have been various permutations, but looking at my trajectory, I was born into a family of folk singers and storytellers very concerned with the oral tradition. And the oral tradition is markedly different than the literary tradition and operates on different rules. You could almost say that this is where the subconscious, the liminal, the dream world, the world of ritual, strange kinds of preconceptions and hunches. It's a much more intuitive and flexible level. The literary stream prides itself on, executive function, higher cognitive, very logical. We are the Enlightenment, right? So that is going along here. Whereas the folk oral tradition is kind of bubbling along just above and just below that collective unconscious level that C.G. Jung describes. And I didn't realize how important that was, that I had grown up burbling along in that place until I went into academia and realized that they're missing 90% of the possible data group.
It's shocking, isn't it?
Okay, so you get right away what I'm talking about, that they're only playing with 10% of the available pool of information, if that. And that this was really a huge loss. So what I've been interested in doing all along is how can I bring some of that missing 90% and weave it into the structure of my academic life without dismissing or voiding the beauty of those high arid places. I think of academia as the high arid place on the mountain where it hasn't rained in 1,000 years, but it's very clear. You can see a long way, but nothing grows. So how do you bring up some of that misty, moisty, generative stuff without completely ruining the stratosphere level here. Because I think, in the long history of humanity, there was, okay, I'm accepting that the fact that there was probably a good evolutionary reason for Descartes. I mean, sometimes I have to talk myself through this again. The idea that you're going to split mind and matter because you just needed a little freedom, a little space. And in fact, it helped enormously when I read that Descartes actually had access to the news of Galileo's imprisonment and humiliation. I somehow hadn't realized they were that close in time. So he knew what had happened to Galileo when he went in pre-publication of his book. And when he is talking to his friend and correspondent, Princess Elizabeth, he kind of explains to her why he had to separate mind and matter. He did not want the interference of the Catholic Church.
He wanted freedom on both sides.
He needed freedom. And to not be harassed by the church, he had to say, no, I'm not talking about anything that concerns you. I'm only talking about this very small little piece of the pie over here. You don't have to worry about it. It doesn't touch the soul. And that's kind of a dark bargain to have made, because
Oh, that's so interesting. Tell me why you think it's dark. I think it was brilliant.
Because as a good scientist and researcher, to say I'm carving out this little piece so you don't have to worry, that can't be true because everything's interconnected. You can't say I'm going to specialize in the left hand. I'll tell you everything you want to know about the left hand. Yeah, that doesn't really work, does it? Because everything in the body is connected. So it's an artificial construct. But even so, I understand why he did it, why he felt it was necessary, and the advantages that have come from that. But clearly, we need to start putting the pieces back together again. In every sense. All of the pieces everywhere that have been broken apart, we need to start bringing them back together again. I think the time is certainly ripe.
Well, I have a question about that, because one of the ways that people in the materialist worldview of scientific endeavors put the pieces back together is they say, right, there is only one thing. There is no mental. There is no soul. It's just the matter, right? But they're putting it back together. So I think we have to be careful about how we put it together.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. Because if you put it together and you leave out the heart and the soul, humans don't flourish in that environment. It's interesting. I've been doing a lot of actual academic work in the last couple of years on burnout, the Great Resignation. I taught a whole college class called The Great Resignation, Philosophies of Work and Leisure. And of course, the students rushed to it. I taught it in the 2021-22 calendar year. So we're all just like floundering after the pandemic, and the puzzlement to the researchers on why Americans were resigning in such huge numbers, just like lemmings over a cliff. Every month the numbers come out and another 1 million people have left the workforce and another 2 million have left the workforce. It's just like fleeing in droves. It's like, yeah, human beings have multiple needs. I mean, Abraham Maslow's hierarchy, is not a good scaffold for nothing. He's telling us we need more than what we're getting. And if the workplace is denying us the opportunity to have a full and complete life, something is going to give at some point. And clearly the pandemic and the isolation and the terror of not having that bottom piece of the functioning pyramid. I mean, if you have no security, no safety, you're afraid to even breathe the air, that's going to have repercussions all the way up, as it certainly did. So yeah, putting it back together again is very difficult, but you can't leave out a difficult piece just because it's messy and you can't figure out how it relates to everything else. What Teilhard de Chardin did, he started with the idea is that the ultimately small building block is consciousness itself. And if you just start with that presumption, it's very easy to create hypotheses that will work. You know, why start with the presumption that there's inertness and that consciousness is some kind of little rarefied flower that sits on top of things after several billion years? It's like, that's just a hypothesis. Why don't we just start with the other one and see how we end up? It's like, oh, that explains a lot more. And a good hypothesis should explain as much as possible. And
I
so
agree. I
yeah,
agree.
yeah,
I want to interrupt you here for a second because it's really
yeah.
important to me, because you have a thing that I hear, and because I know you, where you cite people in your conversation, which is an academic habit. But
Oh, yeah.
I want to hear, and that's fine, but I want to be clear about what Rebecca Armstrong brings
Mhm.
to the picture on this planet that
Mm,
wasn't here before,
mm.
if you're willing to share that.
So what I'm getting is the speech of the grandmothers, and this must be related to the image that I had yesterday. I was driving home from Grand Rapids and I thought to myself, oh, tomorrow is my conversation with Julia. How wonderful will that be? And immediately this image rose up in consciousness of this beautiful, deep, flowing river. And underneath the surface of the river, you could see these huge faces. I said, oh, those are the faces of the ancestors. And on the river, over one of these faces, a huge bubble would rise, like something filled with air. And then a bird would swoop down, and with its talons, it would puncture the bubble, and it pulled up a scroll. And so it was this incredible scene. I mean, it was a huge, wide river filled with the millions of ancestors, and the sky was teeming with birds that would swoop down and puncture a bubble and pick up a scroll. I thought, that's such a gorgeous, that, of course, that's my conversations with Julia have always been like that, right? That there's some deep ancient knowledge that's trying to surface, and we understand conversation to be a tool for lifting up that wisdom. And sometimes you have to, the talon breaking the surface of the bubble. It's a little vigorous. It requires the willingness to break through things. But then you've got this ancient wisdom from the ancestors that's now available to us. So, yeah. So that's Rebecca's contribution.
That's
Rebecca,
fantastic.
Rebecca thinks in metaphor. My husband Max was asked once, how do you know if Rebecca is speaking to you like literally or metaphorically? And Max looked at them and said, if her mouth is open, she's speaking in metaphor. Okay. He knows me.
I don't think I've ever had a literal conversation with you. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, right. I think that's absolutely accurate.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
But if you think poetically and symbolically, everything is metaphor anyway.
Oh,
So
yeah,
why get stuck in the literal? Let's just go right to the symbolic
yeah.
because it's more inclusive.
Well, and it's more accurate.
Yeah, I mean, the image I just shared with you, that's pretty clear. That's pretty clear what it is I'm doing and what it is that we're doing right now.
Yeah.
And that's
So,
why sometimes I name the ancestors, like
yeah.
Galileo or
Just like,
Taylor.
well, it is perfect. I've nothing against that. I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
wanted to I knew there was a thing to get to there.
Right. And that's it. That's it. And
Yeah.
it's very, for me, it's delightful to feel that I am in conversation with the ancestors.
Yeah.
It's very beautiful and consoling and reassuring. It's like, no, you are our daughter, and we respect the fact that you want to be part of this big conversation. Yeah. So whatever part of the conversation you want to carry, you go for it. You swoop down with your talons and you take that little piece of scroll, whatever it is on that you want to take. Yeah.
It occurs to me, you originally said your passion was research, and it occurs to me that the word research is so interesting because it's like looking again.
That's
So
right.
as if your soul already knows, but now you have to come down with the bird and
Right. Well,
find the
exactly
scroll.
like the book.
Yeah.
My soul knew that reincarnation was real, and it
Yeah.
was excited to find that there was an English word to describe that.
Yeah.
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 Find it again.
Yeah. How do you read the scroll? Do you read the scroll, or do other people read the scroll? Does the scroll matter to you, or is it the popping, or all of it?
I think the scroll must be important for me because of the amount of time that I've spent in books, in learning calligraphy, in being a calligrapher, in looking at letters, the magic of language and letter. I think the idea that the letters themselves are sacred, that Odin was willing to give his eye in order to receive letters, that's very significant. So that words themselves are another way of seeing. And I don't want to give that up. I don't want to lose that. That's really important to me.
Well, and you referred to two people who have lost their sight, Galileo and Odin, or I guess Odin's a god. So, but I mean, two beings who have lost their sight in exchange for wisdom. And it's, to me, losing sight is kind of a metaphor for losing the focus on the external. It turns the focus internal, which is another connection to all that is.
That's right. Yeah, no, that's a good call on that. That's true. So the idea of blindness is some of the great characters do not attain their wisdom until they go blind. Think of King Lear, for instance, or Oedipus. The wisdom comes after the physical blinding.
They're less distracted by the external.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. As my favorite poet, Rainer Maria Rilke, says in Letters to a Young Poet, do not be confused by the surface of things. In the depths, all becomes law.
God, that's so good.
Isn't that perfect? And it's exactly verbally what your painting behind you says.
True.
Do not be confused by all these different things that apparently have these quirky properties. In the depths, it becomes a perfect jigsaw puzzle with a mathematical certainty that is so beautiful and clear. It's a principle. It's a law. The law of the periodic table. Boom.
Boom. All right. Well, before we go, we have another few minutes. I feel like you've encapsulated a lot of the journey and what this conversation is like, which is sort of part of your passion, is conversations like these, I think, because this is part of the kind of broader research you're talking about.
Yes.
Is there anything you'd like to add that comes to your heart?
That I thought of communicating with you when I had an amazing dream about time, and how right now, at this stage of our development as a culture, we don't really grasp the importance of time. We make all sorts of silly, childlike mistakes around time and timing and our relationship to it. And in my dream, I imagined an alien race that had come down and was trying to inform us about how many of our problems are based on inaccurate assumptions about time. The very next night, I had a corrective dream where the aliens chided me. It's like, aliens, we've been visiting you in dreams your entire life. We're your family. How could you call us aliens? We're just slightly ahead of you in this, and we would never judge you. We would never say that you were stupid or childless. And they said, here, we want to give you a gift. Come in to our space. We want to show you Arvo Pärt in the afterlife. Arvo Pärt is the great Estonian composer. And since this group of beings incarnate as musical chords, they were collaborating with Arvo Pärt in this huge otherworldly cathedral designed as a three-pointed star. So Arvo Pärt's consciousness was at the center of the star, and then these beings were incarnating as chords of music, breathing in this tripartite balance, so that the one chord would start, and then just before they finished their exhalation, another chord would come in. It was like this incredible breathing going on. And then there was a long silence, and suddenly all three began to intone at once. And it was the most exquisite sound. And I felt myself being plucked up by the armpits and just dragged out of there. And a voice said, no, 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 you can't withstand that yet. It would shake your body to pieces. It's too much for you. But it was like, this is what you get to look forward to, that there will be music that is so much more beautiful, like a rainbow with so many more colors than you have in your system. Yeah, just wait. You will then understand the nature of breathing and timing and the synchronicity and the importance of bringing it all together. You know, the dream, the essence of the dream was, we have to understand when it's time for a simultaneous movement of all things. But it's not just evolution, progressive and linear. It's that at certain moments, everything has to come down on a downbeat all together, and that's what propels the next forward movement. So the simultaneity generator was the name of that first dream, but that's what we're supposed to be working on right now.
Wow.
To understand when it all comes together, like, and in music we already do that. You know, you have this little progression and that progression, and the woodwinds are doing this and the brass, and then suddenly, oh, and that's just such a moment in a great symphony.
Wow.
When it all comes together. So,
well, thanks for adding that.
Yeah.
Also addresses
time is your thing. And so, you know, I don't know what that will mean for Julia, but that was the dream I had when I thought of you.
Thank you. Thanks for being with me today and talking about your passion. I love you. I love our friendship. I love our conversations.
I love you too. And I think I've been breathing faster just watching you. So I feel like maybe I've gotten a little bit of aerobic benefit out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Sympathetic simultaneous breathing. All right, I'm going to turn off the recording.
Okay.